Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, wrapped in a pandemic that's resurgent. It actually has never really stopped surging. And not just in the United States, a number of other countries are seeing the same pattern. It's a heating planet, a human heated planet. And politically, right now, it is a completely overwrought and overheated climate in the United States. Unbelievable events unfolding in real time. I'm showing you C-SPAN's broadcast from the floor of the House, where the discussion is underway now, the second such discussion on impeaching this president. It's an extraordinary time. When the show was organized, we were going to discuss climate policy in this new political environment, but we're going to dive a little bit more profoundly just into the question of policy, any kind of policy, in a fractured democracy, not quite fractured, but certainly one that's been flexed right to the breaking point. The Constitution and its various other elements so far have held firm. The courts have done their job. Congress is trying to figure out how it can do its job. And I have a wonderful panel here today to lead us in a brisk discussion of where do we go from where we are, wherever that is. I write and speak a lot about deep uncertainty and what's called compound risk. You know, in climate change, you think of compound risk as having a hurricane and a COVID-19 pandemic at the same time. How do you evacuate without spreading contagion? But now we have so many layers, it's hard to even begin to count them, of disruption with the political system in the foreground at the moment. So thankfully, I've got here today Jerry Taylor, longtime policy figure in Washington, who had been at the Cato Institute for a couple of decades, who now calls himself a recovering libertarian and radical moderate. And he was a prominent climate skeptic. That's how I first got to know of him and his work there at Cato back in the day. And now he runs the Niskanen Center, founded and runs it, which is devoted to open governance, to the power of the individual, but also to common sense when it comes to issues that are revealed by science. Valuable voice, and his learning curve is so illuminating and valuable. It's great to have you here, Jerry. We have Elise Gout, who is at the other end of the spectrum of career. She's just beginning her career. She's at the Center for American Progress, after a very successful run at Columbia University in the undergraduate program on sustainable development, where I think we're a fencing champion. That's a skill, or at least a mental skill, that could come in handy in Washington going forward in the issues like climate policy you deal with. Elise, it's great to have you here. And Amy Harder, a longtime journalist on the energy climate beat, but also very tuned into all things political in Washington, is here again. I think the last time I was with you was several years ago at the Wilson Center. Maybe it was one of those, what are the stories of the year events on climate? And, you know, here too, what's the story of the year for climate is sort of in the background until we figure out the current events. And finally, Kami Akavan, who's the new executive director at USC of the Center for the Political Future. And I just love that name in the context of current events as well. We'll learn more about that with his work. He was also, I first got to know of him when he was running procon.org, which is a fantastic educational website where people articulate divergent points of view, but in a fact-based way, and a little different than a conventional debate. And I'd love to talk about that too in the context of what's going on. I'm Andy Revkin, longtime journalist, mostly at the New York Times, now at Columbia University, trying to build an initiative on communication and sustainability. And so every day I kind of wake up saying, how can we make information and connectivity matter a little more? And in the context of this moment, it's sort of, again, where do we go from here? And I thought we'd start with, I actually want to start with Kami, because your center is so, even by its name and its goals, is so central to this idea of the political future. So when you think about this moment, and tell us a little bit about your background too, how you got to be who you are, that would be great. What comes to mind looking around you right now?
Well, thank you, Annie. It's a pleasure for me to be on this program with such esteemed panelists. I'll tell you my personal story because it relates to the professional, but I was born in the backseat of a taxi cab in Tehran, Iran. I grew up in South Louisiana among the Cajuns. Neighbors were names like Thibodeau and Cormier and Sashry. Moved to Southern California where my neighbors had names like Gonzalez and Lopez. Very different worlds, but same country. Been naturally a bridge builder as a result. It's in the context of being put in different environments, like many people who live in this country, that you're exposed to different points of view. And the exposure to different points of view is a privilege. It is a increasing rarity in a country that is driven largely by social media, echo chambers, self-segregation, gerrymandering, the self-sorting on all different fronts, and happening at institutional levels as well as personal levels, where we don't even talk to our neighbors or family members because of differences in politics. It's in this fractured system that our government now sits, and we're forced to try to figure out, well, how are we going to make any progress if we don't even talk to folks who disagree with us? So the Center for Political Future is a perfect home for me because it allows me to do what I was born to do, and that is build bridges, find areas for compromise, train future leaders, try to get past this hyperpartisanship so we can focus on some real deep systemic problems in our country that are not going to go away and are only going to get worse. So in that context, what we've been doing at the center is bringing in prominent people, both sides of the aisle, to do just that, focus on solutions. How are we going to fix this mess? And there's a lot of messes. So we're talking today about climate and how we can deal with that. I have tons of data, information, perspectives, et cetera, to share, but I don't mean to hog the floor here. And I appreciate you starting with me because to me, we have to ground everything with, we are starting with a polarized country, tough to make progress on any issue, much less these hugely consequential ones like climate, much less in an environment where we have a raging pandemic on our hands. 5 of the deadliest days in the history of this pandemic have been in 2021, and we just started. The worst day ever was yesterday. We had over 4,200 deaths. In that context, and in this polarized environment, and with this economic downturn, where we saw a jobs report, people are losing jobs, not gaining jobs. We're not coming out of this strongly enough yet. That's where we need to make progress on climate change. So I appreciate you letting me start off the discussion with just grounding where we are.
Yeah, and this issue of how to sort of engage constructively amid deep, often irreconcilable differences, but still get something done is profoundly important right now. There are colleagues of mine at Columbia. Peter Coleman runs the Difficult Conversations Laboratory, which as soon as I stumbled on it a year ago when I just started here, I was like, oh my God, does the world need that? And that pro-con mechanism that you had worked on and what you're doing now are very relevant to that. Amy Harder, as a journalist on The Beat, can you just describe journalistically your experience this past week or two and how you think about climate in the context of these grand sort of waves that are flooding coastlines everywhere from this slosh, the big slosh, we'll call it?
Yeah, definitely. And Andy, thanks so much for inviting me to take part. Just to kind of go 30,000 feet high on this, I've been covering energy and climate change for more than a decade, and I spent many of my earlier years roaming the halls of Congress and the Capitol building. And so when that attack occurred last week, I think me, like so many other people, felt really emotional. And, there's been comments about how reporters aren't allowed, in the area off the House floor because one time I had a denim jacket on. And then you see all these people coming in with, and so it was a really emotional event that I think some people, to kind of bring it back to what we're talking about now, some people have said perhaps it's providing a shock to the system because apparently a global pandemic with thousands of people dying every day is not enough of a shock, unfortunately. So I do think there is the potential for climate change to be wrapped up in a renewed sense of normalcy. That doesn't mean there's going to be a carbon tax next year. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But nonetheless, I think it could provide a shock that enables more bipartisan policies on, relatively narrow, but still really important climate and energy policies. I think we saw at the end of last year, some, relatively big policies put in place on energy and climate change, extending renewable energy tax credits and getting through a policy that would phase out, refrigerants that are really intensive greenhouse gas emissions. And that's something that the industry has supported, that would be affected by this. The industry has supported it for years, and the Trump administration sort of dragged its feet. And so it finally got across the finish line. I see the potential for that type of bipartisanship to continue in the next Congress, particularly with senators like Joe Manchin, a Democrat from West Virginia, a coal state, running the Energy Committee. So there's that side. And then the other side, sort of to get at your point, as a journalist, I really take a global view of this. I actually recently relocated to Seattle, Washington, where I had planned pre-pandemic to do a more global and national coverage of both the impacts of climate change itself and also the impacts of climate policy. And so I think I look at all of this like a big grand puzzle. And so that the impacts of a warming world, whether it's heat waves, wildfires, and what have you, those are all contributing to this overall debate of a public being more concerned about this issue. And that's one of the many puzzle pieces that I'll be watching at this year as well. And it looks like we lost Andy. So I, as the other journalist on the panel, I'm going to go ahead and take over the moderating until we get Andy back. So I want to turn to you, Jerry. Jerry, you and I haven't chatted in a while. I hope you are doing well amid this pandemic. You probably tweeted about this and I missed it, but can you kind of reflect on how you think the last week's events are going to potentially affect any sort of energy and climate policy going forward?
Well, I think it's been a huge impact, a complete reshuffling of the deck. First of all, the most obvious is the Democratic control of the Senate. That opens up the Senate floor to leftist center policy action. Even though the numbers are still more or less the same as they were prior to the election in Georgia, it's control of the floor that is most critical here. And that means that what was latently possible, which were bipartisan coalitions or transpartisan coalitions with moderates in the Republican Party joining with moderates in the Democratic Party to move policy work. Now there's oxygen for that. That's the most obvious important thing that happened last week. The uprising on the 6th and the insurgency and the fallout from that has likewise, I think, increased the possibility of policy action on the climate front and in other fronts. And the main reason for that is that, look, Senate leadership and party leaders only have as much power as the legislators want to give them. It's not like there's a set of rules that Mitch McConnell uses to hammer Republicans in a line. He has the power that they grant them. And a homogenous caucus, which is relatively united, has a lot of reasons to hand off power to the to their party leaders. But a fractured Congress with heterogeneous perspectives are far less likely to hand off that power to party leaders. And the one thing you're seeing in the Republican Party, I think it's always been overlooked at how fractured the GOP truly is. It looks like this homogenous Frankenstein's nightmare to people outside of the party. But for those of us who are within it and understand it pretty well, the fracturing didn't just start last week. But it has tremendously deepened the fractures that were already there, which means that appeals to party unity are less capable of moving someone like Lisa Murkowski or Mitt Romney today than they were last week, which means that there is a lot more space now for transpartisan work. While I agree with you, Amy, I'm not going to Vegas or on any of the online sites and making bets on carbon tax in this Congress. But on the other hand, I think the chances of some sort of carbon pricing moving in this Congress are higher than most people suspect, simply because it's one way around a filibuster. You can move that policy through reconciliation. And given the conversations we've had with Republicans in the Senate, I think there are there are arguably anywhere between 3 and 9 Republican votes that could be thrown into a carbon pricing bill. And if that's the case, and they actually mean some ambition in that, and if that remains to be seen, then I could well imagine something getting done. Not predicting it, because it's always safe to predict it won't. But I think the chances are better than most people suspect.
So thank you, Amy. We had a little power flicker here in the Hudson Valley a minute ago, and the internet just went down. So I'm on my phone, but back. Sorry about that. I guess we all have to be adaptive, right now. And speaking of being adaptive and agile, Elise, your generation faces such a moment. I mean, we've all faced moments. My brother just missed the Vietnam War. You know, my father was at the tail end of World War II. Everyone has had there's the Depression for our grandparents, et cetera. But right now, it's just so epic and so relentless, whether it's just the pandemic, what it's done to people who are recent graduates. So how are you doing, first of all? And then tell us a little bit about your work that you'll be doing at the Center for American Progress. And then we can get back into kind of reacting to the discussion so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andy. And really excited to be here with such great panelists. It's been hard. And I think you're right to say that this pandemic for a lot of people in the younger generation is sort of the first direct incident that's going to be a lived moment of history. And that's felt in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people, depending on your circumstances and your situation. I feel very fortunate to A, be employed, and B, get to work at a place like the Center for American Progress. I'm a part of the climate policy work there. And for us, it's really just kind of kicked things into overdrive, to be honest. I think there's been an incredible mobilization among young people this past year around the election, around climate issues, around social justice issues. And I feel like that's going to continue, particularly in light of what we've seen over the last couple of weeks. I can say from a climate policy standpoint, now that we do have the outcome of the Georgia Senate runoffs, it puts things back on the table that weren't on the table before. So in terms of climate policy, we have new vehicles that could be really great opportunities. Jerry mentioned reconciliation. I think that's something a lot of us have our eyes on right now. It also means that the different people that Biden is nominating for his cabinet can go through and be appointed with a lot more ease. And that's important because it means you're going to have a government that in different sectors of the economy is thinking about climate as an important part of their day-to-day decision making. The third thing, which is a little bit wonkier, is the Congressional Review Act, which is just another tool in the toolbox. But all of these pieces are kinds of things that are at our disposal now. And if anything, I would say personally, and also just within the younger climate movement right now, there's a lot of energy and there's a lot of desire to hold elected officials accountable because we are in this more fortunate position.
I'm going to throw this up for all of you to a certain extent. Maybe Amy first, and thanks again for taking over the MC job. And you might have brought this up already, but the bill that the climate and energy components that were stuck in that bill, there's some broader lessons there. I think that the question, I guess, would be, can we do in a non-emergency basis what was done there? And a lot of things that are not climate foreground, meaning energy innovation money, some of the elements that went in there, some things that you could get bipartisan support on, in part because they're not a climate bill, as opposed to the other. Are there broader reverberations there or not?
Definitely. And, I guess sort of to answer that with your second question first, I mean, Congress, of course, does its best work at the 11th hour after it's exhausted all other more reasonable options. And so recent history has shown that this is how big policy gets done, at least on energy and climate change. So in 2015, many of us may remember that in the budget bill in December, the Congress lifted a 40-year-old ban on oil exports, which the oil industry really wanted, alongside extending, once again, wind and solar tax cuts. And so that sort of pairing was a classic example of Washington grand bargaining. The wind and solar companies wanted the tax credits, the oil industry wanted the ban lifted, and those two industries don't compete against each other. So it was easy for Congress to pair those things as a grand bargain. And you saw a similar thing happen in this last spending bill. And notably, a lot of these things are incredibly important for climate change, of course, but they're not necessarily couched that way in conversations with Congress. I talked for years with the industry, which includes air conditioning companies, manufacturers, and others that are planning to make new refrigerants that are climate friendly in response to the policy that passed late last year. They're couching it as American competitiveness and jobs. They're things, Trump likes, and the Republicans, just as importantly, which is why it got Republican support, which is really necessary given the way, obviously, the Senate is currently in control of by Republicans. And so I anticipate, at least in this first several months of this Congress, given everything else happening in the world, the pandemic, the economic recession that's resulting from this pandemic, that climate change will be a key part of this. You're seeing that from incoming Senate Majority Leader Schumer of New York. He said the climate crisis, as he says it, is the second or third priority he often lists. But I don't anticipate, but I would love input from the other panelists. I don't think, Senator Schumer is going to put on the table a carbon tax or a clean energy standard. Instead, he's going to, put a bunch of money in. Washington is so much better at doing carrots as opposed to sticks. Put a lot of money in there for electric vehicle charging and things like that. But just today, I was on the call with the head of the American Petroleum Institute, who said they're going to fight any subsidies for electric vehicle charging stations because they don't think they deserve subsidies. He said that gasoline stations didn't get subsidies, so EV charging stations shouldn't. So you're going to see big fights over that.
Sure.
And it's still going to be important, even if it isn't the sort of comprehensive climate policy that people in the media, including myself, are sometimes overly focused on.
Yeah, I want to bring up the sort of the Biden strategy question a little bit here, and I'd love to hear from Jerry too on this. I just want to show something. I have this piece as part of a package of essays that are in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. They asked a bunch of people, so what should Biden do? And I weighed in on climate, and I assessed the big question to me is this stress and tension that's always been there when the Democrats get in, and I assume Republicans too, which is how much do you focus on the first 100 days, meaning the big aggressive moves, and then how much do you strategize around the long haul picture? In this case, it would be having two administrations and hopefully not having Congress flip back toward being adversarial in 2 years. And so the piece I wrote was let Biden be Biden, meaning that the long time frame, a little patience, even in the face of urgency around climate, feels to me to be the only strategy that can lead to the kinds of changes you would need that are at the scale of the climate system. And I don't know whether that resonates or feels silly. Jerry, maybe you first on this question of what Biden's capable of.
Well, normally when I enter into these conversations, I infuriate progressives by pointing out the obvious, which we pretend is not the case. And the obvious is that the main obstacle to climate action is the Republican Party and Republican intransigence. And so any political strategy to advance climate action has to account for Republican opposition. It has to tell me a story about how it's going to be undercut, how it's going to be reduced, denuded, or put aside, because unless a legislative package or a policy strategy isn't in the business of reducing Republican opposition, then it's simply in the business of delusion. That's the fundamental thing that needs to be kept in mind. So how should Biden go forward in the 117th? In a fashion which reduces Republican opposition to the greatest extent possible and brings Republicans along. And that's a lot of tactical decision making that people are paid the big bucks to execute. I'm running a think tank. I've not had experience in legislative action in the Congress, so I'm not the right person to turn to for exactly which hill should be seized first, second, or third, or when this valley should be crossed, or what have you. But it's important to keep in mind something that really highlights this issue. Political scientists James Curry and Francis Lee recently undertook an examination of important legislative initiatives that were part of the leading package that majorities in Congress have tried to pass over the past 30 years. And what they found is that only 4% of the time did a political party pass signature legislative projects without the majority support of the minority party. Think about that. In other words, it's virtually impossible to unilaterally govern without the other side. And of that sea of 4% success rate, almost all of that 4% success rate occurred when the governing party had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, which the Democrats most certainly do not. So everything needs to, for people who are serious about passing climate legislation, and maybe we should write that off. I mean, you could make an argument that, that's an impossible lift. Who's kidding who? We need to go through executive action and agency work and whatnot to advance the ball. And maybe that is the case. But if my own belief is that if we mean serious ambition on the climate front, we simply do not have the regulatory tools to get from here to there right now, particularly with a Trumpist Republican judiciary playing referee about what the EPA and other agencies can and cannot do. It means we're going to have legislative action, which means it has to be undertaken with that fundamental consideration in mind, an ability to move Republicans.
That brings to mind also this the ideas that have emerged in linking climate investment and policy to the rebuilding of the economy after COVID-19. There's a lot of jobs there. Howard Frumkin, who's an epidemiologist I had on our show early last year, whatever that means, had proposed, a Depression era style mass investment in workers related to resilience on climate, but also to resilience and public health. So that feels like there might be some room to wiggle in there too. Elise, when you're either in your position or just generally, what's your sense of the role of Washington, and how does this relate to the tensions activists always feel about the urgency of now? The Green New Deal was all about a very tight timetable, a huge package. That's not going to happen in that way, but what comes to mind when you see the roadblocks, you see the path dependency, and want to get stuff done?
Yeah, I mean, I think I do agree in a lot of ways with what Jerry was saying, in that there has just been this incredible history of Republican obstruction around climate issues. And while we do have majority in House and Senate, it's a very razor thin majority. And so I expect that there's going to be a considerable amount of negotiating and trying to get the votes together. With someone like Joe Manchin having as much power and authority as he now has, I think finding opportunities that also support West Virginian constituents is going to become more critical than it did before. So there are these new pathways that are going to be continually, I think, reviewed and considered and hashed out again, just in terms of a climate strategy game plan. But I would also argue that the urgency of the issue is such that we can't dilute what we're advocating for and what we're fighting for, just given the urgency and sort of the unprecedented nature of the climate crisis. I think for me, I see this as sort of a yes and approach in some ways, where legislatively there's a lot that we can and should try to do, and it certainly would be a lot less subject, I think, to the pendulum swinging that you see with more executive action. But that's not to say that what happens administratively also isn't critically and crucially important. At CAP, one of our sort of, frameworks or theory for change has to do with 3 buckets. The first of that is the types of standards that you'd want to see across sectors of the economy, things like reaching a clean power sector by 2035. The second has to do a lot more with large, sweeping public investment. And I think that's where you start to get more into what you spoke to, Andy, where economic recovery and green economic recovery are synonymous, and I think need to kind of happen as one central idea together. And when you see the type of large infrastructure spending that President-elect Biden has committed to, that also opens up opportunities for emissions reductions, including in some of the most impacted communities. And that brings me to the third piece, which is prioritizing and really establishing a commitment to equity and justice moving forward. I think it's important to recognize that just having an innovation plan in the way that I think a lot of elected Republicans have isn't enough, and that there's incredibly terrible things happening with frontline communities, often communities of color, that need to be addressed as well in whatever type of economic recovery green plan that we have moving forward. And that's, to me, where I see a lot of the urgency playing out in real time. I think it's a lot of what has resulted in the galvanization of the young movement of climate activists, people like Sunrise, who have shown in the last year that climate can and is oftentimes a winning issue. And so that urgency is felt by me personally very acutely. And I think it just kind of speaks to the fact that it's an all hands on deck approach these next 4 years to try and find all the corners that we can to make things happen.
And Kami, I want to bring you in here too. And this notion of what's been articulated here pretty clearly is the systemic nature of the climate problem. It's if you don't have justice and inclusion, basically full political inclusion for communities that have been historically hammered most by climate. For example, the recent New York Times story that was so powerful, showing that redlining patterns dating back from the 30s, the 1930s, had influenced the outsized vulnerability of Black populations in cities across the country. So that's implicitly part of the solution to the climate challenge is all the basic stuff that was being fought over last year too, that, a vote for everybody, a legal vote for everybody. And Kami, thinking about the goals of the USC project and generally your own work in this, is that the front line? If you have a truly inclusive, transparent discourse, does that sort of assist these more granular questions like clean energy policy?
Well, it certainly does assist it, but we're talking about, one, we have a narrow window of opportunity, the perceived narrow window of opportunity. We're already talking about 2022 midterm elections, and if history repeats itself, we're going to see these Democratic gains disappear. We're already talking about who's running in 2024. Politics, as you know, is very opportunistic. And so there's that factor that has to be crossed with the other factor that climate change is not a short-tailed problem. This is a long-tailed thing. I mean, look, the IPCC, that was formed in 1988, right? We've known about NASA warned us that CO2 is warming our planet and changing the climate in 1988, right? These are long-term problems, and we're now.
I have to show my 1988 cover story.
Right? And yet, despite that, look, and when we did a national poll along with a lot of other organizations, and we were asking constituents what issues are most important to them. We did this all throughout last year. Climate was not in the top 5 for folks. It was the pandemic, it was the economy, it was racial justice issues, there's other issues. When we ask our students now, what issue is most important to you after the election, it's climate. It's number one. For young people, and I think demographically, generationally, for young people, climate is hugely important. Young people talk about climate not as an economic issue. It is a moral imperative. It is an existential threat to the future, to the world that they will inherit. For most Americans, it is not that. It is, and to the GOP, it is certainly not that. It is an economic issue. Look, the GOP is one of the only political parties of all the major economies in the world that does not recognize that climate change is primarily caused by humans in the world, right? So we're a real outlier. So how do you get that side, to Jerry's point, how do you get that side to come along? I think you got to do what Elise is suggesting. You have to make climate an economic issue in order to get that bipartisan level of support. And how do you do that? Joe Biden is in some ways similar to California Governor Jerry Brown. He was a celebrity in his first term as governor, right? And a lot of years passed, he runs again and wins. He has nothing to gain personally. He just wants to get stuff done. Joe Biden, I think, is in that same camp. He's not going to run for re-election, probably. He's looking at this as, what can I do? He is a natural bridge builder. How can he get Republicans to come along? He's put not all, but so many of his chips on the green economy. He's trying to frame this as an economic argument. He's bringing in old timers like John Kerry to be his climate czar, right? And so we're looking at a person who wants the established connections, hit the ground running, make things happen right away. It is not a moral imperative issue. It is, but he's not framing it that way, because I think, to Jerry's point, he's looking to get stuff done. and whether we're going to see that landmark, swing for the fences, carbon tax, capping the fuel economy for cars, whether we're going to see really big things happen or whether we're going to see a lot of reversals from the Trump era changes, whether we're going to see heavy use of reconciliation. And just so everyone's clear, that just means instead of 60 votes that you need in the Senate, you need 51, right? And so it's easier to get to it because if all the Dems agree, then they get to the 51. Are we going to see a lot of use of reconciliation to get stuff done, or are we going to try to be more inclusive? It's hard to get the GOP to come along. If our polls were right, there's not a lot of public support. We've got about 40% of the Republican Party in the last survey that I saw that said they don't believe that climate change is caused primarily by humans. And we've certainly seen leadership reflect that, from President Trump down to various senators and Congress members. We don't even have in the Senate a climate committee. The Dems have one, Republicans do not. The House has a bipartisan one, but not in the Senate. So it's going to be hard to get them to come along. But I think if framed as an economic issue, there's a chance.
I agree with Kami, and I also think it's important to, while it's important to keep in mind that there are boundaries to what can be done, and those boundaries are established by, for the most part, moderate Democrats, I think we can overstate that a little bit. Joe Manchin may not be the king of the world in the Senate. It may end up being Lisa Murkowski. In other words, in a world in which moderate Republicans, or put aside whether you want to call them moderate Republicans, responsible governing Republicans, have access to the floor now with the Democratic majority and the actual ability to build transpartisan alliances, which might not have been the case had the Republicans maintained control of the floor through their majority. It may very well be the Democrats could lose Joe Manchin, but pick up Lisa Murkowski, or pick up Mitt Romney, or pick up another Republican, or a Susan Collins. That's the sort of thing which may attenuate a little bit of what Joe Manchin's power in the Senate as the senator from West Virginia may be carrying into this debate.
One thing I want to broach. Oh, sorry, Elise.
I was just going to also quickly add, I think, to call it for what it is, Kami mentioned that there is continued disbelief about anthropogenic climate change within the Republican Party. And I think part of that also can be attributed to the level of campaign financing that you see from oil and gas and fossil fuel interests as well. So if we're talking about, long-term bipartisan efforts around climate, I think it's worth also mentioning that there's a level of accountability to be had too as to why they're advocating for the policies that they're advocating for.
Well, that reminds me, I wanted to actually talk about that for a second, Elise, because you brought that up earlier, and it was part of Kami's remarks. One of the things which may very well change, at least at the margin, a handful of Republicans in the Senate, might be the critical handful, is the business community's lack of patience with regards to Republican intransigence. Now, there are certain companies that I wouldn't be surprised are greenwashing their support, their notional support for carbon pricing and climate action and whatnot, but there are a lot which aren't. And there are also a number of political actors in the business community who understand that the window will not always be open for market-oriented responses to climate action. That if we continue to hit roadblocks, the amount of political urgency behind action will be so great that the progressive argument that carbon pricing doesn't do enough in quickly enough time, which I disagree with, but a lot of increasing number of progressives are embracing, means that the ability of the business community to have a market-friendly, economically efficient regulatory regime in front of them they can plan around, if it's not executed shortly, it's not going to be executed. There's also the dynamic that as long as the Republican Party is the party of business, they're going to care what the business community has to say. Well, the energy business is becoming a green business. Now, those of you who know the green energy industry far better than me, or at least the political actors there, maybe know why it is that the wind and solar industries are so reluctant to engage with their Republican legislators when it comes to climate policy. But reluctant they are. But at some point, as we see the green energy economy overtaking the fossil fuel industry, the Republican Party, being the party of business, is going to be embracing policies that advantage the green energy industry. Now, that may not happen soon enough for our purposes, But it's a dynamic, I think, that might also be coming into play sooner than we think, simply because of the economic evolution that's occurring in energy technology that's moving in a very green-friendly direction.
I have two comments.
Yep.
Just two quick comments on that. I think we're already seeing a very subtle evolution on this with the Business Roundtable coming out last year saying that it supports a carbon price. I'm pretty skeptical that industry, corporate America writ large will really stick its neck out on carbon pricing. A lot of these companies are not sticking their neck out after, an attack attempted at the Capitol. You're seeing a lot of sort of, we're going to stop political donations for both parties and review it. And so if they're not going to really be impatient about something like this, I think it's going to be even less likely with something as complicated as climate change. But you're still seeing the Chamber of Commerce, whose members are indeed becoming greener and beginning to support more forcefully things like aggressive innovation agendas. And even in Congress, you have a bipartisan clean energy standard being introduced by a Republican from West Virginia. So, and then a Democrat from Oregon. And so I think you're seeing it, but just to kind of tie this back to Elise, what you were saying, as a reporter, I'm just looking at all of this in a very dispassionate perspective. And I was chatting with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island, who has been very vocal about corporations' historical role, particularly the oil and gas industry's role in sowing doubt about climate change. And he's told me that he's going to forcefully urge the Biden administration to investigate organizations like the Heartland Institute, who have received funding from oil and gas companies in the past, and which are now continuing to push false information about climate change. And he says if the Biden administration doesn't do what he wants, he might try to hold up some of his nominees. We'll see if that type of rhetoric holds, but nonetheless, you're going to see pressures like that from progressive corners of the Democratic Party.
It's a great point. The one thing that I was wondering as Jerry was talking about as the donation political money issue came up was whether this moment with the impeachment and the Capitol disruption and the pressure on companies to not support candidates who were part of the insurrection or fomented it, could that give cover? Or you're kind of getting at this, could this be sort of a bigger pivot toward a more ethical approach to how money gets invested generally? In other words, that there's just more of an open space there than there might have been for, I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Well, I think that it's easy to overestimate the influence that the corporate community has on the Republican line on climate denial. It's certainly there from some quarters, but for the most part, these are ideological actors who are falling for ideological arguments, and they are being funded by non-fossil fuel people on the right who are ideologues. I mean, the vast majority of the money that goes into Heartland, which my brother is the president of, though he doesn't share the books with me, but was the case at Cato Institute and elsewhere, they come from ideological actors. Believe me, Rebecca and Bob Mercer didn't make their money in fossil fuel. They're not funding climate denial because of the bottom line. They're just wingnuts. And this has become climate denial has become part of the catechism of right-wing nuttery, not to put too fine a point on it. And so, yeah, I mean, Charles Koch still matters, and his giving, and if you want to call that oil money, you can, even though he's largely driven by an ideological agenda more than he is a bottom line consideration. But the broader point about what happened on Wednesday and how that's affecting the corporate community, I think, is very apt. It's not so much that you have corporate America frustrating action by throwing their weight onto the other side. There is some of that. It's that they are not exerting pressure when they could exert pressure. So that's exactly Amy's point, and she's absolutely spot on. The Business Roundtable, it's all well and good that they have that resolution, but until companies who are members of the Business Roundtable allocate lobbying time to tell members that they don't get their support unless they embrace carbon pricing, or at the very least, they're not going to get their support if they're going around throwing roundhouse punches at their opponents for embracing carbon pricing. Then it's not going to really matter.
So interesting. The one thing that I wanted to bring up that relates to what we were talking about earlier with West Virginia was looking at this with a longer time lens, which is kind of the way the climate system looks at things. It feels pretty encouraging to think that Manchin is not Robert Byrd. That back in the day it was the Byrd-Hagel amendment that upended Kyoto. It was way back in the early days of Clinton, Gore. You interviewed Bill Clinton about this once. The decision, the fight on the BTU tax that Clinton was trying to get in was it was Byrd who dismantled that. It wasn't Republicans, and because of the coal interests. So are we seeing, if you kind of step back to not 50,000 feet, but even 100,000 feet, looking down from the climate system, is there a sense of real progress here, a real change in how the Republicans or coal-dependent Democrats are behaving?
So if I can offer one thing on that, there's two ways to change at this legislative level. One is, if nothing else, younger generations increasingly gaining power, younger generations increasingly believing that humans are absolutely causing climate change and that the peril is existential and must be stemmed immediately. It's just old people are going to die, young people are going to take power, and that will force the changes. So we can wait it out. That's one strategy. The other strategy is we don't have time to wait it out. So we have to make changes now, and that necessarily involves compromise. And that's at a time when it is increasingly difficult to do this. That's something I'm obsessed with, is the level of partisanship in this country. And why is it? When I ran ProCon, if you typed in climate change debate into Google, we were the first site that came up. I heard from all those, what'd you say, Jerry, the right-wing nutters, the wingnuts? I heard from so many of them. But I learned a lot about what it is that they think on climate policy. And the thing is, they are citing data. They're citing information. They're getting it from somewhere. But the thing is, they're getting it from a source that is completely siloed. So none of us will be exposed to that information. We might think it doesn't exist, but for them, that's the world they live in, right? And so they're so isolated. So the way I think to get around this is we can let demographics take effect, but that might take too long. It will take too long. Or we can do something about it. And that legislatively means forcing compromise by building these bipartisan bridges. The Senate now has an opportunity. They're going to have 20 new committee heads, right, over the coming weeks. That's a big deal. And if they continue to frame climate change as a moral issue, they are not going to gain traction with all these Trump supporters. The last thing they want to do is listen to the experts. The experts are who they distrust. There is a trend in America where we're seeing a death of expertise in journalism and in science. They just don't listen to these people. So the last thing we want to do is moralize to the folks who think we shouldn't trust scientists, we shouldn't trust journalists, as wrong as that opinion is. If we do that, they won't listen, right? So we have to start framing it in different ways and communicating about it in different ways. The IPCC, this is as of 3 weeks ago, the group who wrote that report were shocked to hear that people did not understand the word mitigate. When we say, oh, we need to mitigate climate change, it sounds so important. Most people don't know what that means. And so the Dems are framing these issues in ways that are not really relatable. And we have to get back to putting it in this economic context and making it to where people who have lost faith in experts can at least find something relatable because it affects their pocketbooks.
A couple of thoughts on that. There's a book by political scientists Stella Rouse and Ashley Ross called The Politics of Millennials. And for those of you interested in this, I really think you should pick it up. It's fascinating. But one of the things they find when it comes to climate change is that, millennials are very much concerned about climate change, more so than other generations by far. But their distrust or skepticism about government responses is no different than it is for other generations. they are under the impression, your average millennial, that we can address this problem by individually reducing our carbon footprints. And so, for instance, if you look at the New York Times, they have a climate newsletter I get all the time. And more than half the articles are about how to reduce your carbon footprint when you're taking out the trash or doing your laundry or cooking your food or getting to work or recreating. And, that's all well and good. But there is absolutely no damn way we are going to decarbonize the economy based on letting 1,000 decarbonized millennials bloom. We're going to need public policy. And it's one of the reasons I'm a bit skeptical of the idea that the kids are going to save us on climate change. Because once you drill down and get into some of these other nuttier questions with regards to, I don't mean nut like crazy, I mean hard nuts to crack, it's not so obvious they're going to be there. So that's the first problem. As far as the power of industry on this front and the Republican Party, the bottom line here is that unless you get these at least a reasonable number of Republicans to lead on this, is not going to happen. So I absolutely agree. No Democrat's going to throw in a carbon pricing bill and say, let's go and charge the hill. But if you had 4, 5, 6 Republicans in the Senate co-sponsor a carbon pricing bill, a carbon tax, whether it's a climate leadership council, kind of bill, or maybe something that looks like something else, the minute you get a handful of Republicans who put that on the floor and signal seriousness about this, as opposed to just being a messaging bill, then I think that changes everything. But that's going to be on the Republicans. They're the ones who have to start that conversation. I don't begrudge Democrats for saying, yeah, well, we'll wait and see about seriousness until we see them act.
What an interesting time ahead. We have a few more minutes, and it's a time to think about solutions and your last kind of take-home points. On Friday, I'm doing another session with Dominique Brossard, University of Wisconsin, and Matthew Nisbet of Northeastern, on precisely the point that Kami just raised about how to communicate. And so much more listening has to happen, so much more parsing. The idea that we can batter people into belief or concern by doing more of this is a fantasy. It took me a long time. It took me 20 years of reporting before I stumbled into the social sciences, and people were saying, oh, this doesn't work that way. You can't just put a brighter cover on your magazine and make people worried about global warming. So to me, the big shift I've made is toward a model of communication progress that's more around convening and less around story, more around listening and engagement. The Jefferson Center out in the Midwest has done these rural climate dialogues, rural energy dialogues. They have tiny capacities, so there've only been a few, and so they build a conversation from the ground up around well, what do you want your community to be resilient to or not, and what does our energy system look like? And of course, in Texas, that you could have a huge expansion of wind in a state that's deeply conservative. Iowa too had recently had this amazing transition from coal to wind without making the argument about climate. So that feels like one big way forward. How that fits into the legislative arena is for my Beltway colleagues to figure out better, like all of you. So just any last quick thoughts, Amy? What's on your reporting list besides whatever you're doing related to current events?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think one thing that we haven't talked about, but that sort of skirted around the edges, but that I think is going to be really essential under President-elect Biden, I should say, is the role of unions. Biden has always been a union guy, and the clean energy industry is not as unionized as some of the fossil fuel sectors. And so I think given the importance of jobs right now, as we've talked about, and given Biden's historical support from the unions, I think he's really going to compel a lot of strong labor laws into anything he does on clean energy. And I think that could set up some tension, healthy tension, but tension nonetheless with the clean energy industry. But that's sort of an interesting dynamic. I did a column for Axios during the campaign about how, this could set up a pretty interesting showdown between Biden and Elon Musk, because Tesla has a pretty sketchy record when it comes to labor rights. And yet Tesla is in many ways the face of clean energy and tackling climate change. So that's just one interesting area that I'll be watching. In addition to pretty much everything under the sun, I think I'll just close by saying at the end of the day, what Biden does matters insofar as it helps push the world to agree to really reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so he says he'll commit to and hold a climate conference within his first 100 days. So I'll just be saying how all of this fits into the big picture of committing to, of course, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement is easy, but how he'll work with states, which have made big progress on reducing emissions over the last 4 years, and companies, as we've talked about, how he'll work with private industry and states to put forward a new U.S. commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement.
Yes, so much of this is about international affairs, so we'll be doing more webcasts on that too. Elise, from the standpoint of young people, and your own priorities, what's next for you in this context?
Yeah, I think Amy's right to bring up that point on unions. And I would say for me, and from a policy standpoint, a lot of this has to come down to coalition building. And that's not only coalition building to get votes within a legislature, it's also coalition building with labor unions, with environmental justice stakeholders. CAP works really closely with the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. And I think what we've seen over the last 4 years is that while the Trump administration has been effectively rolling back every environmental regulation under the sun, there has been a real effort at relationship building and trust building. And I think for me, looking at what might come next in the future 4 years ahead of us, it's going to come down to the way that those coalitions, the way that those relationships allow us to move the needle a little bit more. Obviously, greenhouse gas emissions reductions to the fullest extent possible is kind of the name of my game and what I'm looking for. But in particular, seeing the way that relationships with environmental justice experts, with leaders of those different communities, help to make sure that whatever solutions we come up with are sustainable and ultimately creating a more livable future.
And I assume at USC the story is the same, just as you were saying. To get engagement requires a lot of back and forthing and some kind of guidance toward concrete outcomes. You can't just talk.
100%. I think we're going to find a couple of issues that rise above. So for one, I just want to plug the USC Center for Political Future. If you sign up for our newsletters, you'll find out about our upcoming climate conference. This will be in the week of today. And we'll be convening a lot of national leaders and experts on all sides of the aisle to figure out where we can find areas to compromise. The issues I think will be big are hemp. Hemp is close to Mitch McConnell's heart. You can get 2 to 3 cycles for a crop in a year instead of waiting 2 to 3 decades for a tree to grow. Look at it for paper and look at it for fiber. It uses far less water, far less pesticide, and far less fertilizer. So it's a very climate-friendly crop that you have seen the governors of Texas, Florida, Kentucky, a lot of the flyover states.
Sorry, I'm showing the wrong thing. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
That was a year ago.
I think that'll be big. And then we're going to see EVs. Right now, you're seeing a lot of IPOs for EV companies. There's going to be a lot more than just Tesla in the marketplace, and not just the vehicles, but the charging stations. Right now in the Port of Long Beach, where America, about a fifth of the U.S. economy flows through that port, they have fleets of electric vehicles that just don't have adequate energy stations. So those trucks are sitting idle. So we're going to have to see a lot of that kind of infrastructure investment to really get the most out of EVs. So it's not just, a rich suburbanites who can afford those vehicles. So we really need to be able to power them. So look to the markets, and I think Republicans can find some gains and pluses there, and look to the Ds and the Senate committees to open up those opportunities.
Well, this has been a really great, I would say, a start to a conversation. I hope you all might think about coming back off and on to as we examine these issues going forward. This week is going to be so focused on one question, which is what happens with the outgoing president, that it's hard to even think forward just along these lines. But it's been great to have you here on Sustain What. This is, I'll just do a little summary. Sustain What is a global online conversation aiming to make the most of the new communication environment that we are all living in, breathing in, connecting with from a distance. It's got all kinds of compromises. There's all kinds of distraction, but the possibility of communicating with impact has never been greater as well. It takes a lot of work. I'm doing it here at the Columbia Earth Institute's new initiative on communication and sustainability. Folks can get in touch with me about future events or feedback on this one by looking at that distracting scrolling bar at the bottom. You can get my contact info there. And thank you, everybody here today. Kami from USC Center for the Political Future, Amy Harder from Axios, and Elise Gout from Columbia, and now the Center for American Progress, and Jerry Taylor from once upon a time Cato Institute, and now his own Niskanen Center for, which just today you released a statement saying that Trump should be impeached as quickly as possible. So we'll see how that plays out. And I want to just show one last thing here if I can. Hold on one second, which is what's happening on Friday. So as I said, and there, my computer's screwing up once again. Well, we survived a blackout and an internet disconnection. Thank you, Amy, for that too. And on Friday, I'll have a session that's very relevant on the same relevant topic. So thanks all for being here today. The links are shareable right from the moment we end. And stay safe, stay sane. They're both important. And come back if you can.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Andy.